And the people of Hancock County probably read that in the paper and thought, where is Sarajevo? Who are the Bosnians? Didn't know anything about these types of world events. Nations and monarchies chose sides, and nearly 3 years later, the United States was finally drawn into this world war. It was a convoluted fray of kingdoms and monarchs that were related to one another. The King of England was a cousin to the Tsar of Russia, was a cousin to the Kaiser of Germany. And the history of the war, as many of you know, is a convoluted, hard thing to understand. But kingdoms were toppled. The map of Europe was redrawn. The Middle East was redrawn. And colonies changed hands. It was quite a thing. So how did this affect the citizens of Hancock County, who were barely even noticing this cauldron in 1914? We're going to take a whirlwind look at that. I do have some slides where there is some narrative on there. Perhaps you're not one that wants to perhaps read these slides, but for whoever does, I decided to write down some information that I wouldn't forget. Findlay's population was quite a bit less back then, less than half of what it is now in the 1917, 1918 era. The mayor was Theodore Totten. He was a second-term guy who had taken some time off between terms. Hancock County had the lowest death rate of all the counties due to the great influenza outbreak, which was interesting. I don't know what we did differently, but we did something well. Another interesting fact, a Wright Pusher airplane was the first airplane to land in the county, out near where the airport is now. But shortly thereafter, overseas, some of our young men would come under fire by airplanes. So this was a new technology, and it was a big factor in the war. But the first plane that landed in Hancock County was during World War I. Actress Sarah Bernhardt made an appearance at the Marvin Theater. Our flag was 48 stars already, but we wouldn't have the 49th star until 1959. So that's an interesting fact. Official time zones came into being during the war. Otherwise, perhaps a train might be in Lima at 11:30, it might leave, and for Findlay, it might arrive at 11:15. So that's how crazy it could have been without official time zones. And even daylight savings time was initiated in 1918. And prohibition was enacted right after the war, as was the women's right to vote, the 19th Amendment. So some interesting things. This was a very interesting and active time in our history. Woodrow Wilson was president, as you probably know, a two-term president. And many of you know that poor Woodrow suffered from a stroke late in his term. And so the last couple of years of his term, essentially, we believe his wife was running things. So an interesting fact there. His main motto when he was up for re-election in 1916 was, Woodrow Wilson, he kept us out of war. And there was a lot of nationalism in the United States, a lot of isolationism. We wanted to stay out of foreign affairs. A lot of peace was in the air. We didn't want any foreign entanglements. Believe it or not, this was 50 some years after the Civil War, but there was still a strong sentiment of the great losses that have been incurred during the Civil War. And not only that, I believe 1907 was the largest year for immigration in the United States. We had a lot of people who were new Americans, and a lot of those were Germans. And they didn't necessarily want to see our nation go to war against the nation where they had originated from. So Woodrow kept us out of war until, after unrestricted U-boat warfare by the Germans and acts of sabotage and the infamous Zimmerman telegram, which perhaps you learned about in middle school history like I did, the result was we ended up declaring war on April 6, 1917. Interesting because we think of the U-boat menace as being a World War II factor, but the U-boats were very active in World War I. It was here again, it was a new technology, but did a lot of damage. And we had already pretty much chosen sides early in the war before we had joined, and we're sending a lot of materials to the Allied powers. And the Germans decided at one point, we're just going to sink the ships coming from America, and whatever happens, happens. And another good reason for us to get in the war, if you could call it good, was the Allied powers owed us a lot of money. They had, oh, excuse me, Joy. Joy's going to do something here with the screen.
I'm not sure.
There'll be a short pause here.
I don't know Right, it just popped up with this other thing.
Technical difficulties. This is what happens in the modern era.
Why is this here?
Can they see that too? Joy, is that the problem?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll talk to you at this time about buying war bonds for the war effort while Joy's fixing my screen.
Why it's doing that. Sorry.
Yeah, Joy, unfortunately, you might just have to keep it up there. I think it pops up with the waiting room.
Oh, okay. Well,
So it's not terribly distracting. We can see it, but we can see the images past it.
Looks great. Don't leave anyone. There's more to come. Okay, anyway, where was I, Joy?
Something very interesting, I'm sure.
But bottom line is, there was strong sentiment in this nation to stay out of this war, and all of a sudden that changed because of U-boat warfare, and we lost some American sailors. Several 125 Americans went down with the Lusitania, the British liner, in 1915. So the drums of war were sounding in the distance. The problem was the United States military was ranked 17th in the world at this time. We really didn't have much of a military. We were almost demilitarized, but we began to build up, and our industry started to come into the fray, and we built up to the point where when the war was declared, we had a little bit of preparedness, not a whole lot. I can move ahead here. Oh, Joy, it's not letting me change to the next screen.
Ron, try just clicking on the screen and then use your arrows.
On the screen, use my arrows.
No? Okay.
heard something, but what are we trying to do?
I'm trying to move to the next screen. So, how did you do that?
I used the arrow key.
Oh, okay. Very good. Okay, we'll move ahead again. We're adding some levity to the Great War here. I think the alliances here are very interesting because as you look at the Central Powers, which we would call the Axis powers in World War II, you see some familiar ones, but on the Allied side, Japan and Italy aligned themselves with the Allies. So this is quite interesting what happened afterwards. So Italy's a friend, Japan is a friend of ours, an ally. Russia again. So this conflagration went on for 3-4 years before we even joined in 1917. A lot had happened. Britain had lost a whole generation of young men. France had lost a generation of people. Russia was being knocked out of the war. So a lot of things happened before we even joined the fray. We did have a local National Guard unit that had served during the Spanish-American War. And also they participated, as you can see there, in the Mexican border expedition to hunt for Pancho Villa. The problem was we were using standard military tactics, and our National Guard unit from Finley was part of this. We were trying to hunt Pancho Villa, this famous guerrilla warfare leader, with standard military tactics. Needless to say, we never found the guy. But we did gain some valuable experience down there. And this gave us a little bit of preparedness entering World War I. And I believe, from what I've read, I think our soldiers gained the nickname Doughboys from our expedition in Mexico. They would go out on these patrols and get so dusty when they came back, their uniforms were covered with dust. They looked like they were made out of dough. So that's, I believe, where the term Doughboys came from. This company stayed together after the Pancho Villa expedition and drilled on town. Stayed together. And some of the then when we were heading towards World War I, some of the members of this unit joined the Rainbow Division, which was training in Columbus, and the rest stayed here and departed for Camp Sheridan as a group and arrived there in July of 1917. So we had a contingent of men from the same town, which was more common in the Civil War than it was in World War I, and they became all members of the 37th Infantry Division. The problem with the men from one town being in the same unit, as you may imagine, is if they're in the same action together, a lot of men from the same community can be lost. which is exactly what happened in the Civil War. Excuse me. But we sent some men down for training, and Hancock County was starting to participate in the war. This division, by the way, the 37th Division, the Buckeye Division, would fight with great distinction all through the rest of the war and into World War II, a very famous division in the Pacific during World War II. And the war hero, Roger Young, perhaps you've heard the name Roger Young, a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, was a member of the 37th Division in World War II. Here are some of the boys that participated in Pershing's expedition into Mexico. So a lot of these boys hunted for Pancho Villa. They don't look too disgruntled that they weren't able to find Pancho. They stayed together, stayed in uniform, and drilled and rolled right into World War I. So here's some doughboys from our very town. Initially, the government tried to go on with a volunteer army. Didn't work too well. Not too many people were interested in joining this conflagration overseas. So a draft was initiated. And you can see there, I don't have to read it to you, there were 4 stages to the draft. Excuse me. The first registration was begun on June 5th, 1917, required all men between the ages of 21 and 31 to register. And from this county, 2,800 men registered, enrolled, and were examined for service. A year later, another segment of the draft, and another 254 men between the ages of 21 and 31 registered. And a third one, as you can see, and 65 more men responded. So all the men who were turning 21 each year were required to register. The most interesting segment of the draft, I believe, was the last one, the 4th one. On September 12, 1918, the registration, as you can see, was increased to all males between ages 18 and 45. Can you imagine having a 45-year-old father or a 45-year-old grandfather who is now eligible for the draft? We obviously, our military was accruing, and they needed people to serve overseas. And our military had grown from about 85,000 men at the beginning of World War I, and it was nearing 4 million by the end of the war. So we really expanded our military and became very powerful. In the bottom line, the local board eventually examined 2,656 men for military service, which is about half of the number of men that we examined for World War II service. And by the way, there were four guys who went AWOL after they were examined. I didn't put that on there, but 4 guys escaped the draft somehow. I don't think they went to Canada. They probably went down to Van Loo or something. I don't know. Just kidding there. I went on Ancestry.com one time to see what I could find. I took the free membership for 2 weeks, and I found my grandfather's draft registration card. I knew that he had not served in World War I, and I never asked him why he died in 65. And I thought, I wonder why Grandpa at age 20, 21 did not serve. Well, he did register. I found his card. He was 21 years old. He registered for the 4th draft, and he simply wasn't called up. So I felt a little bit better after that. Here again, I have some other slides that aren't all narrative, but this is one that I had some interesting facts on. A number of patriotic parades were held and rallies were held in Findlay during the Liberty Loan drives for the war as the young men departed. And these were led by veterans from the Grand Army of the Republic, Civil War veterans and Spanish-American War veterans led these parades and rallies and carried the flags. And so there was the patriotism welled up as the effort went on and as we sent men overseas. And what was very interesting at the bottom, you're starting to get into 2nd and 3rd generations of veterans. For example, Lieutenant George Sibel, as you can see at the bottom, who was killed in Belgium during the war, was the son of a Civil War veteran, John Sibel, who was a 19-year-old member of the 57th Ohio Infantry in the Civil War. Reginald D. Brandt, who died in France, was the grandson of a Civil War veteran. So you've got generations of service and people making the ultimate sacrifice from our county. Here's a great picture of some Findlay boys loaded up on a train car, getting ready to depart for military induction in Toledo. And they're scrawling graffiti on the side of the car. And some of you people who know Findlay history better than I do, they've written the names of the towns that they came from. One's called Bugtown, there's Frogtown. Those are nicknames for local burgs here. Somebody wrote Toledo on there. So they look pretty happy. Not sure how happy they were once they reached these camps where they were drilling and the influenza pandemic was starting to take over, and then some of them made it overseas. So this could be one of the final moments of joviality for a lot of these young men. Here's just another picture of some local doughboys. I'm not sure what unit this might be. This was taken in front of Findlay College. I see Dr. Erner sitting there. Dr. Erner and I have been up these steps a few times, haven't we, Ed? And to think that those doughboys were there just 30 years after that building was built, and they look proud, and the guy in the middle is holding a dog, and they're ready for service. They're ready to roll. Vast sums of money were raised in Hancock County to support the war effort. 5 Liberty loan drives. You showed your patriotism by buying war bonds, obviously. And amazingly, at this time, over $4 million worth of bond money was pledged by people from Hancock County. And some expert told me that translates to about $76 million in today's currency. So if you can imagine this county raising today $76 million for a war drive, that's pretty impressive. The first 2 loan drives were chaired by Ohio Oil Company President J.C. Donnell, a man who could certainly get things done. But then he was recruited nationally to go work on the national loan drive. So the cashier of the American National Bank, AEF, took over the final 3 drives. So we did very well here. I put a picture of Donnell in here because he's well known, obviously, J.C. Donnell, the founder of Ohio Oil Company, but I had forgotten that he was an Irish immigrant, and as a young man had worked as an oil hauler over here, a very low-level job. But you talk about a self-made man. By the time he's in his 30s, his Ohio Oil Company had accrued $108 million of assets. The story of this man's life has probably been told somewhere, but it's a real rags to riches story. And then his son and his grandson carry on the tradition. It's quite an American story. Makes you very proud. Local American Red Cross chapters became involved, and these were all volunteers, mostly ladies. Almost all ladies would come together at the Elks Lodge here in town and in other small burgs, and they would pitch in for the war effort and make all these interesting things that are listed at the bottom. Some of them were kind of humorous because these terms haven't been used in years. They were rolling bandages, they were knitting sweaters, layettes, property bags, all sorts of things. Some of these things I don't even know what they are, but they really volunteered and made an effort for the war and sent a lot of material to hospitals and to Red Cross centers in the States and overseas. Here's the Elks Home, which a lot of us remember. And this is where the local chapter in town would meet. This building obviously was dismantled here 5-10 years ago. But this is where the local Red Cross chapter met. And this building was obviously built by the Donnell family because they were Elks Lodge proponents. It was right beside their company, Marathon Oil. Here's some other local branches. I know they're hard to see, but just to show you how these little towns pitched in, these gals would get together. The top one is the Red Cross branch at Van Loo. The middle one's in Van Buren. The bottom one's at Mount Corey. So you can imagine, and I see some gentlemen in there also. You can imagine them getting together. This is before television, obviously before radio, and getting together and just sharing the news of the day, perhaps talking about their sons and grandsons and husbands overseas and rolling these bandages and making these different implements that were going to be used in the war effort. It must have been quite a social gathering and quite a patriotic time. Something that I hadn't thought about much was the fact that we talk about Rosie the Riveter in World War II, these gals that took over jobs, especially in factories and even on farms, because the men were gone. But these Rosies actually originated in World War I. There were a lot of war jobs that women took over during World War I in factories, in food processing, clerical work, as civilian contractors in communications, in translating different languages into English. And they even began to serve in the uniformed military. You see a traditional nurse on the bottom left, and nursing was evolving as a profession. It was no longer so much something that people volunteered for. It was becoming more of a trained profession during World War I. And the picture on the right is a gal who's actually in a military uniform. And this is the first time that women were actually serving in military uniform during World War I. So women's rights were coming forward at this time. And speaking of that, people of African American descent, of which we had some in this county, served. Now the service was still segregated. It was segregated through World War II, even into 1947. It was finally integrated. This is a gentleman, I took his picture out of a book. I didn't crop it too effectively. You can still see on the left, I didn't do a very good cropping job, but I love the description of Sergeant James Glasgow. And Glasgow is a name that was prevalent in Findlay at one time. And he was a shoemaker, an expert. He went to the school of Cooper and it was a well-known manufacturer of electric shoes in Findlay as a profession. So I tried to find out what electric shoes were, and I don't think I was successful. So maybe at the end, somebody can tell me what electric shoes were. But he made shoes for the Army, and this is a great military picture of him in his uniform. Sergeant Glasgow. Now here's another slide that might be tough to read, but I think we all recognize the name of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Cole, who was born in Van Loo and was a local attorney and was elected to the House of Representatives from 1900 to 1904. Then he was a member of the U.S. Congress and served 3 terms. And then he was, unbelievably, he was not voted for a 3rd term. But that allowed him to come back to Findlay and practice law in Findlay, which was good for us. And then Cole joined the military. And a man of his stature at that time was immediately made an officer, and he served overseas as a major with the 37th Division, the local guys. Cole was well known by the troops over there. He knew a lot of them from his time in Findlay. And when he came back from the war, he was able to directly convey a lot of information to local families about the experiences of the local guys in Europe and in France. And then he returned and was one of the founding members of the American Legion. And that is why the local post of the American Legion is number 3, Ralph D. Cole, post number 3, because he was at that conference where they formed the American Legion. Regrettably, he was seriously injured in a car accident while still a young man and died in 1932. So we lost Colonel Cole, but his legacy is large, and you see his name on the Legion post and on the Main Street Bridge. This is a picture of Ralph Cole, and this, to me, this looks like a military officer, doesn't he? He's got that bearing. I can imagine taking orders from a gentleman like this. And I love those old stand-up collars that the military used to wear. He's got his crossed rifles on there, and just a great-looking picture of a distinguished man. Now, this is something I haven't done before. I actually have a little video here, and I'm going to actually move this video ahead. I hope I can move it ahead. Well, I guess we're going to watch the whole video. This was put together by the Marine Corps, and this was to promote the fact that the Marines served nobly in World War I. They actually were attached to the United States Army at that time. They were a branch of the Navy, but served with infantry troops. And there's a reason why I'm going to play this. Does the sound come across to them?
I have to do something if you
Oh,
want sound.
we need sound, Joy. That would be good. We're not really doing this on the fly. It just looks like it. Joy's going to add the sound here. If not, it can go without the sound. This is actually a mock-up of a newsstand from the wartime, probably in a big city, a young boy selling papers.
Sends papers, 4 years of war leaves millions dead. Get your latest news here. Big news from France, read all about it. Germans close to Paris, 25 miles in 5 days. Those Huns are tough. They're really putting the squeeze on those poor folks in France. The French are fleeing, get the whole story, right here, folks. French ask America for help. That's right, France knows they are no match for the Germans, so we send thousands of Marines. Says here, when the French said war's over, you better retreat, a Marine told them, retreat? Hell, we just got here. Those Marines, those Leathernecks, they're always the first to fight.
1 second, please.
That's right, folks. Hot news right here, straight from the battlefield. Hot news right here from the reporter on the scene. Get your papers here. Big news from France. Our Marines are heading to a big fight at Belleau Wood. Hey, folks, go see for yourself the big fight. Right over there.
I'm going to pause this for a second. What you see now is the Battle of Belleau Wood. Belleau Wood was a nature preserve that was only 30 miles outside of Paris. And the German army was on an offensive in 1918. They were trying to win the war before the Americans got fully involved in the war and got that close to Paris. And we had American Marines that were involved in this battle. And what you're going to see here for about 3 minutes is a battle that took place in a wheat field on the side of the nature preserve. And then I have a story of a local man who was involved in this action. So they moved almost from the trenches out into the open. And this is an actual attack that occurred through a wheat field by United States Marines against a German position. And you'll be able to see that battle. It takes about 3 minutes. Hopefully you'll have some audio here. If not, you can just follow the action. Oh boy, nope, anyway. The Marines had to attack through an open field.
Lieutenant! Six bayonets! Six bayonets! Rock and roll! Oh, Cloudy! Miliziano! Take that gun! Flank right! Close you can! On my mark! Flank left! On it! Cover me! Grenade! Run, boys! Let's get him out! Go!
Now you're probably wondering why I played a 3-minute battle clip. You didn't sign up to watch a war movie, right? The reason being, this battle was as close as the German army got to capturing Paris. There was a real danger that Paris would be captured by the German army in the summer of 1918 with just 6 months left to go in the war. And a man from Hancock County, as you're looking at right there right now, Jay McClellan, was a Marine that was in this battle. And as that wheat field was being attacked and the Marines were out in the open charging against a fortified enemy that was entrenched, as you saw, McClellan was leading a very small band of Marines. There were like 12 or 13 men in his command, and they decided to attack the town of Belleau. There were 200 or 300 Germans in the town. And McClellan said, we're going to charge these guys and maybe they'll bolt. And he was right. They ran up and made a lot of noise, firing guns, and attacked this town with a small contingent, McClellan in the lead. And another Marine company just happened to be coming in from another angle. And the Germans vacated the town. And this is the action, this is the very action in which the US Marines were tagged the devil dogs. And this was done by the German army. They were called the Teufelhunden, which in German, I'm told, means devil dogs. So a man from Hancock County was in the very action where the Marines received their enduring nickname of the devil dogs. And he was decorated for this action. This gentleman who was born in Rawson and who lived a lot of his life in Hancock County, McClelland was, and this is me, excuse me, this is me in the town of Belleau. It's a very small town, about the size of Arlington. It was captured. And James McClelland was awarded the French Legion of Honor by Marshal, the famous Marshal Pétain, the commander of all the French armies, personally pinned the medal of the Croix de Guerre upon the chest of a man from Hancock County, J. McClelland. The previous slide was McClelland's overall commander, General Pershing. This is the commander of the American armies. As you know, he's a very famous man also. But Pétain is interesting to me because he's the commander of the French armies in World War I. Then in World War II, as France is overrun, he's the one who negotiates with the German government, and they form the Vichy French. So he was looked upon almost as a traitor. He just did not want France to be totally occupied by Germany. But Pétain moved from being a very famous commander in World War I to almost being an outcast in World War II. And he was in his 80s, and he was tried after World War II. And some people said he was a traitor, but because of his glorious service in World War I, the Great War, he was not prosecuted. But there's a connection between Marshal Pétain and Hancock County. This is the Belleau Wood Cemetery. I actually visited here 6 years ago. And what's interesting about the Belleau Wood Cemetery, it looks very much like the cemetery in Normandy, quite a bit smaller, but similar rows of crosses, beautifully polished marble. One half of the cemetery, which is behind me, is for the battle deaths. And there's a plot that looks exactly like it on the other side to the left, which is all the Americans who died from influenza while fighting in this battle. Influenza was raging in the summer of 1918. And we lost nearly as many men from the flu as we did in battle at Belleau Wood, as we were doing so all over Europe. Now, this is a very interesting gentleman. His name's George Sibel. You probably saw his name earlier. He is the one who perished in the war. His father had served in World War I in the 57th Ohio Infantry. Sibel, this gentleman you're looking at, and he's buried in Findlay. He was brought back after the war. He's very distinguished. He was in 3 different gas attacks where he was affected by the gas. The Germans gassed his position, and he had to spend a little time in the hospital clearing his system. One time he caught himself on barbed wire and got a blood infection. He was wounded 2 other times, and he finally, another time he caught what they called trench fever. He got not the influenza, but caught a fever from being in the trenches and being in the water and the mud and the cold. So he really made a big sacrifice, and eventually was killed in September of 1918, just 2 weeks before the war ended. But what is the most interesting about George Sibel is he was a white officer that led a black regiment. The 369th Infantry Regiment, as you can read there, were called the Harlem Hellfighters because most of their men were raised from the boroughs of Harlem. They trained together. They sent these guys down south, of all things, to train. And they became a very distinguished regiment during the war. And they were one of 4 regiments that were put under overall French command. The problem was, when the Americans entered the war, the French wanted the Americans to be under their command. They wanted to command our troops. And Pershing said, no, we will command our own men. And not only that, we're not ready to fight yet. We might not be ready to fully be engaged until 1919. And the French said, we need you now. The Germans are marching on our capital. And so Pershing said, I will allow 4 regiments of colored troops, black troops to be under your command, under your direct command. And then the rest of our armies will follow suit. So Sibel and the 369th and a lot of the black troops were some of the first ones to fight for us. And this particular unit, the 369th, they won more awards than any unit in the American Army during World War I. And here again, a man from Findlay, George Sibel, was a lieutenant in the 369th, one of the biggest war heroes ever from the Hancock County, and probably not as well known as people such as the Andrews Raiders or Donald Gary or those, but a very distinguished officer. And this also helped to further break the color barrier. When the black troops first got over there, it was thought that perhaps they wouldn't be able to fight as well as the white troops. So they were given menial tasks initially, such as being stewards and digging trenches and whatnot. And when they were put into combat, just as they had in the Civil War, they showed that they could fight as well or better than anybody, and very much distinguished themselves. This is an interesting story. Otto Schneider was the son of German immigrants, and he and his three brothers all served in the Navy during World War I. And what is the most interesting about Otto is he served on a ship called the USS Cyclops. And this is a picture of the Cyclops. It was a 300-foot-long ship, a collier, and had a crew of 300, a very large ship. You can see the whale boats in the bottom right. You can see how large this ship is. And they made a number of trips down to South America to bring back manganese ore and coal and other things. And on one of their trips back, this ship was lost, of all things, in the Bermuda Triangle. If you can read there, there's a narrative about the Cyclops. It was one of 4 ships from its class that served in the Navy. The ship was lost. It just went missing in the Bermuda Triangle. Nobody knows why to this day. And if you see, I've seen some specials on the History Channel about the Bermuda Triangle, the loss of airplanes, the loss of ships. They always mention the Cyclops because of the loss of 300 men. This was the largest single loss of life in U.S. naval history that was not directly as a result of combat, because it was shown that this ship was not sunk by a U-boat. It just simply went missing. It was probably lost in a storm, or maybe aliens took it away. I'm not sure. They never found out. There was an interesting tale about the fact that they were bringing some German war prisoners back from South America, of all things. Not sure why they were down there. Were probably in the German colonies. And perhaps these prisoners tried to overtake the crew of the ship or something. But I don't know how 12 prisoners could overtake 300 sailors. Another interesting fact at the bottom that you can read here, Otto's 2 brothers, Lawrence and Carl, who were both serving in the Navy in World War I, survived their wartime service, but quite tragically, they both died in the 1930s while they were serving. One died of malaria in 1930. Carl died in 1930 of malaria while serving in the Philippines, and Lawrence drowned in California in 1931. So this family of German immigrants had a triple tragedy in the Navy while they were trying to patriotically serve the nation that they had become immigrants to. There's the Cyclops again. Miles Gelwicks, I have him up here. He was a well-known young man in the area. He had attended dental school and intended to become a dentist, and then joined the military, wanted to be a flyer. And tragically, he was killed in a crash. You can imagine these are the early days of flight. He's flying the biplanes, and they were experimenting with night flying training. And he went into a tailspin and couldn't recover and crashed his plane. The guy with him survived, of all things, but Miles was killed in the accident. So a lot of things can happen in training. We lost a lot of men in training in World War II also. But in World War I, you can imagine it's the first time we're using tanks. It's the first time we're using airplanes, and we're experimenting, and he's killed in a night flying experiment. So there are some other young men, and we lost a total of 66 men in uniform. I've just picked out a few to highlight. The top left, Rice Bell. Rice Bell was a 21-year-old man. He was a bayonet instructor at Camp Sherman. And he was well known. His family was well known in town. His father was an executive for the Ohio Oil Company, and he died of the influenza while instructing at Camp Sherman. The top right, Thomas Weaver, was a young man who died in combat. At the bottom is Ralph Saunders, who was a young physician, a 25-year-old man, and he also died of influenza while serving as a physician. So physicians couldn't do much about the epidemic either. There was so little that was known about this flu as it was raging through military camps, and it was overseas. The German army was suffering from the influenza. The Italians, everybody suffered. And the interesting thing was, from what I've heard, what I've read, it was called the Spanish influenza because it perhaps even originated in the United States, but Spain was neutral, and they weren't saying that they weren't denying that it started there, but nobody else wanted to fess up that it could have perhaps started in the United States or somewhere else. But it's always been dubbed the Spanish flu, and we lost many people to it. Here's another narrative peace. But this is very interesting to me. Jimmy Gray was a well-known athlete at Fostoria High School. He was a football star. He was drafted, and as you can see there, on April 1st, 1918, he boarded a train for Camp Sherman in Chillicothe, went down there, and he was required to march 5 miles in the driving rain right away as part of his training. They hung up their garments when they were done, and they were required to march again the next day. And it was thought that perhaps that they were out in the elements and the flu was in the area, that Jimmy got sick. And here's this great athlete, and he had also played football at Otterbein College, but his flu deepened into pneumonia, and he died in the camp. And 10 days after he left Fostoria, to great fanfare, his friends were there to greet him and to see him off on the train. And 10 days later, he comes back and he's expired. He's gone. It was just so shocking for these people. So this was an obituary type thing. Here's another picture that the picture itself just struck me. This is a young man who was a lieutenant, and he was killed in the famous Battle of the Argonne Forest. His name's Walter Agan. He was a lieutenant, has a very good military demeanor. It's a great looking picture. And this Argonne Forest battle, which was an offensive action by the Allies, was an action that was taken upon after the main German offensive. We put on our own offensive to push them back. And we lost 13 men from Hancock County in this one battle. So Walter Agan was one of 13 local men who died in this one battle. There are 3 other young men. Ralph Simon on the left wrote a piece for the Weekly Jeffersonian. It was one of his letters home. They published it. And also in the same article, there was a letter by Clarence Presnell, who served in the same company with Ralph. And these letters are very detailed, and they tell about a lot what was going on in the battle at the Meuse Argonne. And he talked about one of the interesting lines he put in his letter. He says, "Dad, you will have to change your mind about this war. We're not just going to walk over this enemy. We're not going to come over and walk over this enemy. The Germans are tough, and we're taking a lot of losses, Dad. You need to understand what's going on here." And he fought at a famous battle site called Dead Man's Hill in the Argonne, which had been lost by the French in 1914. They had lost 14,000 men trying to capture this one hill. And here, 4 years later, Ralph Simon and the Americans were able to retake Dead Man's Hill. But this particular company that they served in, the man in the middle, his name is Paul Bayless. He was just a 17-year-old private, and he was killed in this battle. And Ralph saw Mr. Bayless get killed in action. And on the far right, you see Arthur Brown. And the interesting picture about Arthur Brown, he was also lost in the battle. He's posing in front of that cannon that you can still see down at the corner of, down at the intersection of Center Street and Main Street. He's right in front of that same cannon that we have today that was a Civil War relic. So he's posing in a very military posture there. So we had a lot of men who saw action from this county, and we lost a number. We had one prisoner of war that was recorded from Hancock County. Dr. William Gordon, he was another young man. He was in his young 20s, was training as a physician, and was out in no man's land between the lines trying to tend to wounded soldiers of both sides. He was tending to wounded Americans, wounded Germans, and a contingent of soldiers dressed as French military came up and captured them. They allowed them to approach their positions. They thought they were French. They were actually German soldiers dressed as French. And because of that, they were disguised. They were able to capture William Gordon and his comrades. And so Gordon spent the rest of the war, several months, in a POW camp at Villingen-Baden, Germany, and remained there until the end of the war. And when he was released, he did his duty. He stayed in France for a number of months and tended to our wounded who could not be moved back to the United States. So William Gordon, and this is a picture of William Gordon, had quite a record of military service and stayed on after the war to continue to serve and to tend to wounded men. Earl Kennedy, and I'm looking right now as I sit here at a nice display of the love letters that Earl wrote to his girlfriend after the war. He corresponded heavily with his mother during the war, and after the war, he corresponded with his sweetheart, and you can see these letters down here at the museum. But he joined the military, and he registered for service in 1917 and stayed in the military after the war. And by 1925, he became a captain and stayed in the reserves. A sharp-looking individual, another great military picture. The interesting thing about Earl Kennedy, he served in Italy with the 332nd Infantry. That's the only American unit that served in the Italian front. And so what he got to witness was the capitulation of the Austrian army. The Austrians and the Italians were really locked up in a lot of heavy combat. And as the Americans came through near the end, and as Earl's unit was coming through, he saw just piles and lines of bodies and dead horses and wagons. And he saw the carnage of the war, dead civilians and people whose village after village it was flattened. And he wrote about this in his letters, and these were saved by the family. So he wrote quite a historical document on what happened in Italy during the war. And he also put in one of his letters, which I thought was very interesting. He spoke to some of the Austrian prisoners who could speak English, and they told him, they said, you know, if you Americans hadn't come in, we would have defeated the Italians, which Earl thought to himself, there's not a chance that would have happened. They were just being proud that they were getting routed by the Italians. And so you can see Earl's, like I said, Earl's letters from after the war are right here on display, and a nice display at the museum, to his sweetheart. And I put a little plug in here. His future wife, Marie, exchanged letters immediately afterward. There's Marie. And Joy also has developed a blog where you can read some of these letters. Here's an Armistice Day parade in Findlay in 1918. The Armistice was signed on August 11th, the 11th month of the 11th hour of the 11th day is what they say. I believe this picture was taken at the corner at the intersection of Lincoln Street and Main Street. You can see the interurban car line there running on Main Street as they're marching down there. And these little parades were taking place everywhere in every town. And the large ticker tape towns of New York was having ticker tape parades. Findlay was having a parade. There was a parade in Mount Blanchard and Mount Corey. As a matter of fact, I talked to an older gentleman one time who said he lived in Mount Blanchard, and when the armistice was announced, they had a get-together and they hung the Kaiser in effigy. They made a dummy of the Kaiser and strung him up to celebrate the end of the war. So here's the parade in Findlay, and you can see the flags of the British and the French along with the American flag. There is a memorial at Maple Grove Cemetery commemorating the dead from World War I, the war to end all wars, which, as we know now, is not true. War is part of the human condition. On the back side of this edifice are the names of 60 men who died from Hancock County. In my research, I've actually found the names of 6 more. That's what we historians do. We try to prove that there's more to it. But it's not a proud number, because in just a year and a half span, we lost these 66 men, and only half of them were battle related. The rest were influenza and the complications of influenza. So these men all made the ultimate sacrifice, whether it was in the field of battle or from disease or accidents. Greg Goering was probably the first local man who was lost in an act of war during World War I. He was on a transport ship called the Tuscania with hundreds of other troops. They had already crossed the Atlantic. They were skirting around England, around Scotland to get to France, and his ship was torpedoed, and he was lost. He was a 19-year-old man. He was a member of the Flying Corps. He was not a pilot. He was going to be a mechanic. He was a trained mechanic, and Greg was lost in February of 1918. So our first actual loss in action, this young man. And perhaps the last man from Hancock County that was lost was a gentleman who was wounded late in the war, J. Warren Guys. And he was hit in the chest and in the arm by machine gun fire, and was in hospital for about 6 months. And actually he was transported back to the United States. They thought he was recovering, and he went downhill. And 6 months after he was wounded, he passed away in a New York Polytechnic Hospital from wounds received 6 months earlier. And that's how much care has improved since that time. This man would probably have been saved at a later time. And he's also buried in Findlay. This is simply to show the cost of war, the price of freedom to the American forces over time. You can see in the American Revolution, which was fought over a number of years, it was about an 8-year long struggle, and cost us 4,400 lives. Whereas World War I, which was an 18-month endeavor, cost us 116,000 lives. So it's amazing how the numbers accrue as the technology advances and more people are engaged and so on and so forth. The cost of war. This is a plaque that appears somewhere in Hancock County Courthouse. And if we were doing a scavenger hunt, I would say, I'll give a prize to the first person who can find this plaque. I'm not even sure I can find it, but this is in the courthouse. And probably no war has been as commemorated as World War I. You see World War I statues everywhere in small towns and large towns because everyone was hoping the same thing, that this would be the war to end all wars. And we also knew that the United States made such a great contribution to the culmination of this war. So we were very proud of it and proud of our young men. This is simply a poster, and World War I was where the posters, really, the patriotic posters were used most effectively for recruiting, for war bonds, for all sorts of things. And I love this one. This could be Earl Kennedy after the war. He's coming back to see his family business, and he's reporting back to work. And the gentleman saying, "I can tell you've been a soldier by the way you stand, and report for work tomorrow morning." So this was kind of a neat way to show what war can do for a young man serving in the military. You leave a young man and you come back a very experienced person. That's my last slide that I have, Joy. So I think I made my 50 minutes.
You just made it, Ron. Thank you.
For which I apologize.
That's okay. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, Ron. I really appreciate how you always are able to tell those personal stories of those young men. Before we take questions, I did just want to touch on something you had mentioned, Ron. You said something about the African-American sergeant who had worked for Mr. Cooper with the electric shoes, and that little tidbit resonated with me. I knew I had read that somewhere before. So just to let everybody know, the A.R. Cooper Manufacturing Company was located at 210 South Main Street, which was the Davis block. And I believe the trust company is located there now, but it was House of Awards for many years. And Mr. Cooper made shoes to order for crippled and deformed feet. He also invented an arch support with an electric feature, which was located in the sole of the shoe. So that's the electric shoes that you mentioned.
Which was what I was going to share. So never mind.
Yes, good. I knew it would have resonated with Joy too. We've come across that information before. And an interesting fact was that John D. Rockefeller was one of his customers.
Really?
So now we have just a little bit of time. I know some folks may need to break away to get back to work if this is your lunch hour, but if you'd like to stick with us, I'm sure Ron would be happy to answer some questions. So the easiest way for us to do this is if you would use the chat function for your questions. Again, if you're new to Zoom, if you hover your mouse or your cursor at the bottom of the screen towards the center, there's a little icon that says chat. If you click on that, you can put your questions in the chat box. So if you would take a moment to do that. If you have questions, if you're struggling with that after we've tried to field questions through chat, we can ask people to unmute, but this is a little bit easier to manage.
You're only allowed to ask questions that I can answer. And my area of expertise is actually World War II, and I've kind of taken on World War I here as I've gotten more interested in it. And there's so much more history that I haven't even touched on yet. And the involvement of this community in World War I was magnanimous, and I realized that. And the more I learn, the more I need to learn. It's amazing what the involvement was. If anybody has comments, or perhaps you had a relative in World War I that you'd like to say something about, a grandfather or whatnot, if you.
Ron, the first question we have is, this is probably a question more for myself, but they are wondering if your presentation about your father, excuse me, from December is available for us to view online. I believe so. I think we recorded that and it's available as a YouTube link. And actually, Becky, if you want to give me your email address in the chat box, I can send that link directly to you.
I'm sorry that we had a couple technical glitches today. I think when I played that video, I think that was a surprise to the people who were here. So that's on me.
I think you handled it well. Dr. Brumley was saying that his grandfather was 42 in 1918 and was called up. He failed his physical with a rheumatic heart. Sherry says, I have a letter from one of my husband's cousins who served. It says it was written somewhere in the woods of Germany.
Wow. That's amazing. That's quite a relic. You know, it's the war is 102 years behind us already. And I can still remember when the last local World War I veteran died. And I think it was only 10 to 15 years ago. Perhaps Mr. Brumley might know that, but there was a gentleman in a nursing home in Arlington who was a World War I veteran who died not that long ago. And I thought, that's incredible that he had lived that long.
Yeah, that is remarkable. We have a comment from Carol. She says, my father enlisted in World War I. I have his letters to his father. He was gassed and left for dead. According to my records, he was at Alsace Lorraine. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce most of these.
Sure.
Alsace Lorraine, thank you. I have a few tales. Would the society be interested in copies? Yes, Carol. I think that's probably Carol Butler. No, not Carol, a different Carol. Okay. If he was a Hancock County resident, yes, I think we probably would be interested in copies of those. But if you could give us a call at the museum, you can speak with our curator, Joy, and she can talk to you more about that.
One of my greatest fears is that these documents are lost over time. You know, you think as people pass, if their letters and belongings don't go through the channels of their family, these documents are lost forever. And I'm glad to see so many people have knowledge of their relatives and have letters from them. Those are just remarkable things to have in your possession.
Becky and anybody else who is interested, Joy has just posted the link in the chat box, the YouTube link for Ron's presentation in December, his presentation about his father's service in World War II and Ron's trip back to Normandy. Okay, Carol. Yep. Thank you. If you could just give us a call here at the museum again, and Joy can talk with you about those letters.
By the way, I overlooked one thing, Sarah. I actually pulled up one slide short. I said I was going to be the 50-minute man, only the 49-minute man. I brought some copies of this booklet that I authored about the local involvement of people in World War I. And the first 10 people that are in this chat today that are viewing, that come down to the museum, can receive one of those for free. It's got a collection of articles from the Jeffersonian and the Courier, and some pictures of some local people and some other historical anecdotes. So the first 10 people that come down here and ask for one of those, you can have one for free. And that was my COVID project. When everything shut down initially from COVID, I set to work on putting a little pamphlet together. Speaking of COVID, the last thing that I'll say, it's amazing how many parallels can be drawn between now and what was going on in 1918 with the flu. There were many articles about people couldn't attend or didn't want to attend funerals or wakes or whatnot. They were afraid that they would contract the flu. Certain areas of the city were shut down. Attendance had to be kept low because they weren't sure what the effects of the flu would be, or what your attendance at of all things at a funeral of someone who had died of the flu, what the effects would be. So I've seen some parallels there.
Yeah, I think we've seen some of those parallels too, Ron, as we've been researching over the last year or so. Ron, I want to thank you so much for promoting the museum and just about everything you do by giving away free books and talking about our new exhibit with the Kennedy letters. We really appreciate that. So Ron has authored several great books of local history. And so we're excited to have this one. So if you come down to the museum, as he said, the first 10 folks that mention it, we will give you a free copy. Thanks to Ron. There was another question from Dr. Brumley. He wondered if the World War II stories of Hancock County had been submitted to the magazine World War II.
I don't believe so. I don't believe they have. Those exist on the file there. You can find those here, but I haven't submitted anything to that magazine. I know what that magazine is. It's a good one, but the answer is no, Mr. Brumley.
And anyone who isn't comfortable or wasn't able using the chat function, if you want to unmute yourself now, if you have a question for Ron.
Here again, it has to be one I can answer. I won't take it.
Do we have any idea how many females, nurses or what have you, might have perished in World War One?
I do not know that, Dr. Erner. I don't think we lost anyone locally, but I'm sure some perished for sure. I mean, they were right in there in those hospitals with those patients. So that would be interesting to know. And that's another sacrifice that the females made. You know, they're kind of overlooked to a degree. You know, I talked about them becoming, nursing becoming a profession, but obviously they were right in there. And that had even happened with the early COVID cases, didn't it? We didn't know that much, and a lot of COVID was contracted by the first responders. So
Yes.
I'd like to find that out myself. So you just gave me a question, Dr. Erner. I feel like I'm back in your classroom.
Hey, we can do this.
Oh, we got an answer. Joy, come over here and tell. And Joy Bennett's going to help us here, Dr. Erner.
Yay! Yay! Yay!
1,500.
1,500 nurses perished from the flu while working in the hospitals during the
Oh,
war.
not specifically, that was just in the war.
Just in the war period. Okay.
I didn't get.
I would guess most of those were probably
Well,
influenza
there was
cases.
shelling and.
Sure. We have an answer, a partial answer.
Ron, somebody had wanted you to clarify where that video clip was from. They had joined a little bit late, I think in the middle of that video.
That was posted on a Marine Corps website. There's a Marine Corps Association, and I clipped that from them. I don't know the name of it, but they put things out regularly promoting the Marine Corps. If they could find that site, maybe Google it, United States Marine Corps Association, I think they can find that clip. And it just so happened when I saw that clip, I thought, that's exactly where James McClellan was. And I actually contacted the Marine Corps about that clip and said, that lieutenant that's being portrayed there wouldn't happen to be, and the guy said, no, that's just a general clip, but we do know about McClellan. So that's what I can tell you about the clip. I probably infringed on a copyright showing that. I don't care. It's all part of the history here.
We have someone asking if there are unit rosters available because they would like to track down a family member.
There probably are. I don't have any of those, but
Joy may be able to answer that one as well.
I found the internet has revealed some things that are amazing. And this Ancestry, I'm not promoting Ancestry, but I took the 2-week free trial and then I dropped it after I got one. But there were some things on there that surprised me that were there. People actually do tough research and post it on there. So perhaps you could find a roster there, or if you know the number of your ancestors' unit, for example, the 145th Infantry Regiment, something like that. If you Google search that, sometimes you can find a roster.
Another comment from Dr. Brumley saying that the Cleveland Clinic actually started as the doctors who went over to the war, came back to find their jobs were gone. And so the clinic was established by Dr. Kryl.
That is interesting. You know, Mr. Brumley has a lot of good information. He needs to make a presentation because he knows a lot.
We'll get him to do that. I think our calendar might be full for 2021, but believe you me, I have written down his name and all of his areas of expertise as well.
I love to be educated by the audience, and I am. And this is, I learned so much by the input. I really appreciate that.
Also, for folks still with us, Joy has just put another link in for anybody who is interested in trying to research World War I rosters. She's got an internet link there that might be helpful to you. Okay. I think we are going to wrap up for the afternoon then. Again, Ron, we so appreciate your time and your interest in local history and your passion for the museum and being able to share that with others. I know there were several comments on here about what a great job you did today. We really appreciate it.
Still consider myself a bumbling amateur, but appreciate that anyway.
Hardly. You did a wonderful job. So thank you to Ron and thank you to all of you for joining us. And again, April 1st is our April Brown Bag Lecture. We'll be doing it in person, but you can still register to join us via Zoom as well. So get in your reservations for that. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your week and a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.